thought I would try to start out by talking about the title of the book, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs. That was something that our marketing people were a little bit concerned about because they said, it makes him sound like some religious figure. People are going to think that this is a book about religion, and there is religion in the book, but they weren't sure how people would take it. And the other part of it is, the concern that I had was that people would be thinking that we were calling him the most blessed of the patriarchs. Now, that might work for Peter, but for an African-American woman to call Jefferson the most blessed of the patriarchs, I feel I'd be voted off the island, the Black Island, that I would be sent away from that. But it's such a striking title because that's how he described himself. And the book is about Jefferson's understanding of who he was. And it's trying to get into the mind of an 18th century slaveholder, 18th century plantation owner, to try to figure out what is going on there. We felt that what has happened over the years, so many things have been written about Jefferson that people's interpretations have sort of taken over, and they describe or delimit who he actually was. And we thought we'd try to go back actually to his letters and to primary sources and to try to figure out if we could find something else out about this person. And he's an important person because his life, his words, his work really speak to all of the really important issues that are still at play in the United States. The issue of race, the legacies of slavery, politics, all of those kinds of things can be discussed through Jefferson's life. We're in a moment now, the sort of Hamilton moment, where people are sort of trumpeting Hamilton as the sort of person of the moment, the founder that we should all glom onto and look to and whatever. And we can talk about that later on. But the difficulty with Hamilton, the difficulty with the other founders, is that there's nobody's life that touches on all of the things that I just described. Hamilton, you have to turn white people black in order to get black people in Hamilton's life, in the play. There aren't any people there. Lin-Manuel Miranda said in an interview, we brought him to, actually he didn't come to Scheer, but he did an interview for a historical association that I belong to, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And one of the things that Lin-Manuel Miranda said was, because there was a complaint by people like me about the lack of actual black characters in the play. You sort of forget that there are no black people up there because, there are black people up there, but they're not portraying actual black people other than sort of a reference to Sally Hemings, a quick reference to Sally Hemings. And he said, he wanted to keep to people who were in Hamilton's life. And there aren't any black people. There's not. He lived in New York. He bought a couple of slaves. It's not clear. He clearly bought slaves for his in-laws. And there are a couple of sort of ambiguous references to purchasing people. But we don't know if they're purchasing for himself. He says for myself, but we don't know if it's for himself and then he's going to give them to his in-laws or whatever. But New York was not a slave society. There were many slaves in New York, but it's not a slave society like Virginia was a slave society. Virginia, 40% of the people were black. It was South Carolina, you think of 2-to-1 black, and then by the time you get to the Civil War, it's 3-to-1. So it's a very, very different situation with Hamilton and Jefferson. So it's not about, battle of the founding fathers, who's better than the other, or the battle of, slaveholders or whatever. The question is, Jefferson's life is representative, has comments on so many different things that's why it's an interesting topic. And so I think it's important to come to grips with him also because black people from the very beginning talked to Jefferson about this. They saw Jefferson as an important figure. I did an article called Engaging the Founding Father in Blacks in Engaging Thomas Jefferson. Back from the days of the founding, Benjamin Banneker writes to Jefferson. People talk about the Declaration of Independence as a promise. The Declaration of Independence gave enslaved people a sense that, that there were possibilities. And so he is, having said that, all men are created equal, having written that document, even though those words mean much more to us now than meant to him then, we have sort of taken that document and interpreted and used it in ways, whether he intended or not, they certainly have been effective for the purposes of African American people, for the LGBT community, for women, all people who try to make a place in the United States look to the Declaration of Independence, and not just us, but people in the world look to the Declaration of Independence. So whatever the personal failures of this particular individual, whether he intended all of these things to happen or not, I think is kind of immaterial. I mean, it's interesting to know, but that isn't the real thing. It's the document, it's the words, it's the sentiments that matter. So Jefferson is an important figure for that reason, whether you hate him, love him, or whether you're indifferent, or whether you take what I try to do, a historical approach to this, Jefferson as a subject. And what does his life say about the nature of race and slavery and all the things that I mentioned before? How can we use this to understand the United States? Because of all the kinds of hypocrisies, all the kinds of the critiques that people make about Jefferson, he sort of embodies the United States. In a way, he's sort of representative of that. And so that's what makes him an interesting subject. Peter and I, who've known each other since 1995, when I wrote my first book, I was a law professor at New York Law School. I was supposed to be writing a law review article, and I wasn't, because I was writing a law review article, but I wasn't really interested in it, and it's very tough to write about something that you're not really interested in. And I saw a newspaper article about a movie, Jefferson in Paris, and that they were going to make this movie and that they were going to treat the Sally Hemings story as the truth. And so a lot of people were up in arms about it, saying that there's no evidence that this happened. And that was the impetus for me to write my first book, which was really not about whether Tom and Sally had kids together. It was really about the way historians wrote about it and how I think they gave short shrift to the words of African American people who talked about their family histories, and that you can use family histories just as you use family histories of white people to create history. You could use the family histories of black people to do it as well. So I wrote this manuscript up, and I was looking around for people to read it, people who assumed would be opposed to it. This notion that the historians had not been fair to African American people. And Peter was, at the time, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation professor at the University of Virginia. So I thought to myself, who would be better, more likely to be upset about this than the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation professor of Virginia? Because the previous ones had Duma Malone, the person who's seen as the Jefferson scholar, who wrote 6 volumes of Jefferson's life, a 6-volume biography of Jefferson. He was certainly opposed to it. His successor, Merrill Peterson, was certainly opposed to it, and Peter came after Merrill. So you stereotype people, it's not fair, but I thought, okay, he's a person to send this to. So I called him up on the phone, and thinking that, picked up the phone, dialed the number, thinking that his secretary, or assistant as we call them, would answer. Instead, again, a stereotype, a guy answered, so I was sort of flustered there for a moment, and I said, I'm trying to reach Professor Onuff. And he said, well, this is Professor Onuff. And I said, well, may I help you? And I said, well, I wanted to try to send you a query letter about this manuscript that I've written. He said, well, this is sort of like a query call, right? Right away, he was teasing me in the beginning. And we'd known each other for, all of 15 seconds on a phone. And so I should have known then what this was going to be like. So he was teasing me about this, and I explained what I wanted, and he said, sure, send it down. And I sent it, and he read it, and he liked it. And I was surprised that he liked it. And he was very, very adamant about trying to get it published at the University Press of Virginia, to publish the book, because this is Jefferson's University. I had one level of interest from another trade publication, but I decided to go with Virginia at Peter's suggestion. So we go back a very, very long way. And we've been having this discussion about Jefferson all of these years, and we decided a few years ago that we should sit down and put some of the things that we'd been talking about and been thinking about on paper and actually do a book together. This is something that historians don't typically do. He's collaborated with his brother, and sometimes historians collaborate, but writing together is not an easy thing. Because sometimes you have different ideas about things, and it's all great until you get to the very end and you have to send it off to the publisher. As you're working on it, you say, sure, go ahead, fine. And then you say to yourself, I'll change that later. But when you're actually doing the final point, then there were some moments of tension. But for the most part, we worked very, very well together. And we wanted to create a book that talked about the sort of central ideas in Jefferson's life. We had 3 parts. We thought of him as this patriarch. We took the name, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, from a letter that he wrote to Angelica Church. Has anybody seen Hamilton? Oh, wow, my goodness, look at this. Angelica. Angelica Church was a friend of Jefferson's too. They met in Paris, and in 1793, when he is leaving the cabinet, after Alexander Hamilton has sort of beat him up, or actually has won Washington's favor, and he realizes that he's not going to be able to win, and so he's going to resign, and he resigns, and he writes to Angelica, who is still in London, and he tells her that he's going home, and I'm going home to my books and I have my fields to farm and, my books to read or whatever. And he says, if my daughters join me, I will consider myself to be as blessed as the most blessed of the patriarchs. And so we thought, that's an interesting phrase. In another letter, he writes to a man, and he says, he calls himself an antediluvian. I'm living like an antediluvian patriarch among my family and at my farm. And we sort of think that's an interesting way to describe yourself, because when you think about a patriarch, as I said before, you think of a figure of old. It seems ancient. A patriarch, farms, fields, slaves, enslaved people. But he would say, my people, the watch for the happiness of those who labor for mine. In other words, for the enslaved people at Monticello. And this sort of grand vision of himself. This is a person who's supposed to be a Republican. Republican with a small r. A person who is anti-monocrat, a person who believes in the vote, who believes in equality, who is trying to get the common man, namely the common white man, more power in Virginia, who wants a public education system, who believes in science. There's a story that we think is probably apocryphal about Jefferson eating a tomato on the courthouse steps in the 1770s. Some people thought that tomatoes were poisonous. And so this sort of a symbolic of this person who's trying to tell other people, don't be afraid. There are things, go beyond your comfort zone. And we don't know that that's true, but I do think it sort of embodies what people thought about him, somebody who was a harbinger of the new. Well, what is this person doing, calling himself a patriarch? And, invoking this figure from long ago. So we wanted to figure out how he came to view himself that way. What were the influences in his life that made him think that he was like that and he was a patriarch? Well, certainly being born into a slave society, being a slaveholder and born into a slave society. We divide this up into 3 sections. The first one is, we talk about the patriarch. What does this come from? Well, Virginia, his home, being born at the top of the social ladder, being male. He has all the kinds of advantages that that would make a person that arrogant, in a way. He's white, he's male, he's born into a prosperous society, he's almost 6'3", in a time when that's not, being tall mattered. I guess being tall matters now. People still think about about leadership, all those kinds of things. He was smart, he read a lot, so he kind of thought he was pretty impressed with himself. And so he thought that he was the kind of person who should lead. He also saw himself as a progressive, and that's really hard for us to see now because Jefferson is portrayed as this very conservative kind of person, but for his time, people saw him as a radical. People thought he was going to lead a slave revolt. I mean, it's crazy, right? I mean, the people in South Carolina thought, you know what, he's gonna gather up all the slaves and kill all of us. Well, obviously that was crazy, but it was because of some of the things that he said in Notes in the State of Virginia about slavery, against slavery, and the sort of excised part of the Declaration of Independence, where he blames the king for the slave trade. But more important than that, which is silly, but more important than that, the way he talks about taking people, sort of crime against humanity, taking against a group of people who've never done anything to him, dragging them across the ocean. I mean, that kind of language that really sort of expresses why slavery is a bad thing, why it was an evil thing. So he's saying these kinds of things. He sees himself as a progressive, but he's in this community that is nowhere near ready to do the things in many fronts that he thought ought to be done. He believed that slavery was an evil, but he also did not think that black and white people could live together in harmony, and that is the chief problem that people have with Jefferson. So we have the Declaration of Independence, and we have his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, where someone asks him, a Frenchman writes to all of the governors of the colonies and asks them to describe their states, the then states. Instead of writing back a letter, he writes a whole book, and he talks about all aspects of Virginian society, and he talks about slavery, condemns slavery, but he also talks about race. And he says, I venture it as a suspicion only that blacks are mentally inferior to whites. And he says, white people look better than whites. White people look better than blacks. I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but you get the idea. These are the kinds of things we read today, and if he had the parts of the Notes on the State of Virginia that he thought were going to really, really get him into trouble are the parts about slavery, right? But we don't care about that, or we notice that. But what we notice today is this stuff about race and this notion that whites and blacks could not live together because blacks would never forgive whites for what they had done. Whites would never give up their prejudices. He said that we could not have a wholesale mixture of black and white, which is interesting because we'll get to the why later in a moment. This 1782, whites and blacks can't mix together. And if blacks and whites, if whites try to live together after emancipation, there will be a race war. And again, we hear that and you think, this is crazy, right? A race war, ha, ha, ha. Well, it's kind of been something like that after the end of emancipation. There's been a Cold War, certainly, and certainly a hot war. When you think about lynching, you think about all kind of economic violence, you think about hostility. It hasn't been easy. So we congratulate ourselves on our, forward-thinkingness, how well we have done. But if you think about what he's saying here, he's saying this is going to be really, really tough, and it has been tough. I mean, we're still struggling with these kinds of things. So this notion of race is central to Jefferson's notion of the nation because he doesn't see how it can be done. He didn't have the confidence that it could be done. So the liberal position, again, the progressive position was emancipation. The plan he wrote was to educate blacks, males up to 21, women up to 18, and then find a place. At first, it was going to be out west, but then he decides, no, the west is for white people, or to Africa, or to Haiti, or Saint Domingue, as then that time, that island, which was crazy because why would slaveholders educate black people, spend money to educate black people up to that point to send them off somewhere? So that was like you got to wonder if these are not utopian solutions that he knows will never take place, but he wants to be seen as if he's thinking about it in a way. But that was his idea. But he did not think that slavery would last. Either there would be a war, And he says, and there is no aspect of the Almighty that could take our side, that is to say, whites. But the only thing that could be done would be emancipation and expatriation. And that was the view of Jefferson, that was the view of Madison, of John Marshall, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Abraham Lincoln for a time, and then sort of moved back from all of that. There was no notion that we could have the kind of society that we want to bring into existence, and that is a multiracial society that is not totally, that isn't in a state of war, but we kind of are in a state of tension and have been since the very, very beginning when we're working, trying to do something about it, but it hasn't been easy. So we talk about the society that formed him, that gave him his understanding about slavery, his understanding about race. We do a middle section that talks about France, and that's important because it is in France where Jefferson's personal life takes a very interesting turn. He had been married to a woman named Martha Wales Jefferson, whose father had had 6 children with a woman named Elizabeth Hemings, an enslaved woman on his plantation. 6 children, the youngest of whom was named Sarah Hemings, or Sally Hemings. Jefferson goes to Paris as a diplomat. He stays there for 5 years, and while he's there, he takes James Hemings, who is Sally Hemings' older brother, and his eldest daughter, Martha, with him. And he leaves behind Sarah Hemings, or Sally, with his 2 youngest daughters, and Polly and Jane, and Polly and Lucy, excuse me. And so he leaves them behind, and when his youngest daughter dies of whooping cough, he says, I want Polly to join me. And she's supposed to come over to me with what he describes as a careful Negro woman, Isabel, which is Isabel Hearn, who was about 28 at the time. So that's who he thought was going to come over to Paris with his daughter. Turns out that Jefferson's sister-in-law, and this gets very convoluted, Jefferson's sister-in-law is also Sally Hemings' half-sister, sends her and Polly across the ocean. Sally Hemings is 14 at the time. Polly is 9, so you got to figure what kind of nursemaid she would have been, But enslaved children were childminders, probably from the age of 7 to about age 14, so that they were actually to the age of 10, or 10 or 12, because at that point they would go to the field. Sally Hemings is a childminder at 14 because she's Jefferson's wife's sister. She's not going to the fields. The Hemings women never went to the fields, so that's why she's a little old to be a childminder, actually. So, in that sense, to be sort of like a companion to a young girl. So, she comes over. They end up at Abigail Adams's house in London, and Abigail Adams is aghast because this is a girl. A girl has been sent. She was expecting Isabel Hearn, 28, 29. That's middle-aged in those days. And they sent her with this girl, and she says, the girl needs more care than Polly, that she's probably exaggerating in the way that Abigail Adams did. So any event, so Jefferson is not expecting Sally Hemings to come over, and he knows he obviously figures out who she's talking about when she writes back to her and says Sally and the Negro girl who's with her. So Sally Hemings comes to Paris, and she's there for nearly 3 years, and while she's there, she and Jefferson, and we'll talk about this, however we want to call this, she becomes pregnant by Jefferson. And in Paris, she and her brother have the opportunity to remain as free people if they petition to do that. And they threaten to do it. As a matter of fact, as we talk about in the book, none of the young people with Jefferson, neither of his 2 daughters, he'd also come over with a man named William Short as his secretary. None of those people wanted to go home. Sally Hemings didn't want to go home. They wanted to stay in Paris, and at some point he's trying to get everybody out of there. His daughter is 17, of marriageable age. He doesn't want her to marry a Frenchman. At one point she mentions that she has forgotten how to think in English. She was losing the ability to do that, and so that freaked him out totally. And so he's trying to get them home. Sally Hemings is pregnant. She doesn't want to go home. She's going to stay in Paris. And he promises her that if she comes back to Monticello with him, she will have a good life. Her children will be freed when they're grown. They'll stay with them, and when they're adults, they'll leave. And she agrees to come back. She's 16 at this point. So 16 is, I mean, we think of a 16-year-old as a baby, because they are babies. I mean, certainly in today's world they are. I mean, we've sort of extended childhood to the 30s now, whatever. On and on. Did you see the thing in the New York Times about the woman at the pediatrician's office, and she's 30? You know, it's like, you're at the pediatrician. You just doesn't want to give up her pediatrician. There's nothing. I mean, I understand, you know, that your people are wedded to people who've been important in their lives, but the point is, in 16 in the 18th century is not a child. But when I was writing my other book, The Hemingses of Monticello, when I was forced to think through this, my daughter was almost that age, and I just couldn't get this out of my mind. You know, a 16-year-old in this kind of situation, a 16-year-old who thinks that she could stay in Paris, which, you know, a lot of historians who disputed the story said nobody would ever think that. No, you know, that's the thing that makes it implausible. Why would a 16-year-old, but that's exactly the person who would think that, a young person. But it's the process of not thinking of African-American people, as human, as being able to imagine what is in the mind of a 16-year-old. 16-year-olds at the time, and you know, people wrote about them as impetuous, as lacking judgment, as, and don't want to use the term romantic, but have a sense of themselves that, you know, is not quite adult. But I think historians looking at that could not see Sally Hemings as a person in that way. So the important thing that Peter and I talk about in this regard about France is that France is where Jefferson really comes to grips with slavery, where he makes his peace with slavery. I think the Hemingses have a lot to do with this, because they are enslaved, but they're not really enslaved, and he sees himself acting towards them as a quote-unquote good master, and then we recoil at that. But we're not making a judgment about whether he's right or wrong. We're trying to explain what it is he is thinking here. And he's there with them. He pays them wages. James has free movement in Paris. And he looks around and he sees peasants starving in France. 18th century France, revolutionary France, was in a mess. And there are beggars everywhere, and it's just a horrible, horrible scene in a lot of ways. A huge, huge inequality. He writes about the inequality, the terrible problem that they have there with people who are really, really wealthy and people who have absolutely nothing. And he says, well, they're struggling in their society, and eventually they're going to get this right, and eventually we're going to get this right. And so he kind of puts slavery on a shelf, because before he had, you know, been outspoken about it, that something had to be done. But after Sally, I think that's part of it, certainly making a peace with deciding I'm going back to America with these people, my wife's siblings, and I'm going to create a life there with them. He does that, and he sort of turns his back on any kind of advocacy about slavery. I mean, the last part of the book is about things that, more, I guess, sort of personal things, not sort of intimate things, but other influences on Jefferson's life: religion, music, and politics. And those things sort of, all of them fit together with this notion that he sees himself as a steward, as a patriarch, as a person who's supposed to be disseminating information to America. He opens up Monticello to visitors, and he kind of turns Monticello into a museum. Have people been to Monticello? Some people have been. Yeah, I mean, it's cluttered, and most of the things that are there, we don't have all of the things that were there when he was there. He saw it as a museum. Come to visit me and see all the things that I brought back from France, and you get to see the best of the world, and I'm going to show it to people. So again, this is somebody who sees himself He has a very, very high opinion of himself. And such a high opinion of himself that in the end, he begins to think about religion, and he thinks that he can shape America's religious vision. And we end up talking about Jefferson and religion. This is something that is sort of a really, really heated subject for a number of people. Down in Texas, my home state, they wanted to take him out of the history books because he did not believe that Jesus was divine. He thought Jesus was, he said, the most perfect moral philosopher who ever lived. But Jesus was not God. He was not a God. He was not divine. And of course, that's a problem in Texas. Yeah, that's a problem for Texans. So they wanted to take him out of the history books and replace him. And they replaced him with John Calvin. John Calvin, you know, that noted American. But it's a problem because what Jefferson did, not only did he say that Jesus wasn't divine and didn't, perform miracles, he took the Bible and he cut it up. He cut out all of the things that he thought were miracles, things that Jesus did not say himself that he did. He said a lot of things were sort of attributed to Jesus that Jesus never directly said that he did. So he has created what is called the Jefferson Bible. It was actually called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. And this book actually for a time was given out to members of the House of Representatives, as a sort of a secular text, all the good parts of the Bible, be kind to people, all those kinds of, Jesus teachings, but not, raising people from the dead or anything like that. You can't imagine something like that happen today. I mean, to give a measure of how the country has changed, that in the 20th century, earlier 20th century, you could give this out to members of the House of Representatives, but you could not do this today at all. So he ends up this sort of religious quest that he has with creating this book that he thinks will be a secular text for Americans. And not that he wants to start his own religion, but he kind of did. Or think that people could create an American version of Christianity, and it would be an American version of Christianity that comported with the man that I was describing at the beginning, the person who saw himself as a man of science, and that reason was supposed to be at the head, at the seat of everything, and that's the best way to create a Republican society. Now, this is not a figure that could exist or that we rest comfortably with the sort of modern notions, other than the part about the religion. I'm not talking about cutting up the Bible, but his idea of separation of church and state, and that people should be free to practice their religion in their own way, and that they shouldn't be bothered for that or shouldn't be penalized for all of that. This is probably the legacy of Jefferson that is the least, unless you're in Texas, I was going to say the least controversial. And I'm from Texas. I can do that. I can crack on Texas. That's probably the thing that I think of the sort of liberal vision, that's the thing that people admire about him the most. The racial part of it is a problem. The Hemings part of it is a problem. I mean, this is the tough thing about it. As I said, when we were talking about Hamilton, how you really he doesn't have any black people. He doesn't have Sally Hemings. He doesn't have a group of people who help you think about race and about slavery and about what we're really going to do as Americans. Can we live here as one family, which he didn't think that we could, even though he had a family that included African American people. You remember I told you, he said he thought that once there was emancipation, that blacks should be sent, they should be expatriated. When he dies and he has a will and he frees people, he asks the legislature to allow them to remain in the state, because the Virginia law at the time, the 1806 law, said that if you were emancipated, you had to leave the state within 1 year or you could be re-enslaved. And so he petitions to have these people, only 5 of them, named 2 of them his kids, remain in the state. And he says to do that because that's where their families and their connections are. Well, there's no better answer why all African American people are Americans, because this is where our families and our connections are. And they have been for a very, very, very long time now. I was talking to a man today who's doing a book about the Revolution and talking about black men who fought in the Continental Army and their petitions for pensions, which he says are just amazing. And it's a story that we really don't know. I mean, we know about blacks who fought for the Loyalists, which, made sense because they were trying to gain their freedom. But these people were fighting for their freedom, and people who are already free, but they were patriots too. And that whole history has been lost. So we have a lot to do here. And I still think, as a problematic figure as he is, and people always ask me, well, how did you get interested in him? Or why are you interested in him? It's just that he is an entry point through so many important questions, so many things that are still bedeviling us today. And the question of race is very definitely one of them, race and family, and he embodies all of this in a way that not Hamilton, not any of the other founders actually do. So that's what makes him important. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I want to hear your questions about anything that I've said. There's a microphone here. Someone will run to you with the mic. Over here.
When slavery was abolished in the beginning of the 19th century, the slave population could only be increased by increasing the birth rate. Did that lead to the wide-scale rape of African women, slave women?
You're talking. Oh, you mean the end of the slave trade?
Right.
Oh, in 1808, the end of the slave trade.
The population can only be increased through increasing the birth rate. Did that just allow the masters to rape their women?
Well, I mean, the masters could always rape their women. I think that was a part of it. I think the natural increase, scholars believe, and I believe, and evidence indicates that the natural increase came because of the type of work that enslaved people did in the United States. That's to say, in the West Indies and Brazil, many, many more people were sent to the West Indies and Brazil. There were only about 700,000 Africans brought to the United States. But tobacco cultivation, rice cultivation is not great. But even cotton is not great. But sugarcane is a killer. And because that's what the sugar islands in Brazil, that's what they were doing, people did not survive long enough to reproduce, and they were constantly replenishing the number of enslaved people. So, in Brazil. So the culture, the agricultural product, what was made here, made it easier for African American people to multiply. So masters did not have to rape their slaves, although they did, to increase the population. The natural increase was because of the climate and because of the culture, of the agriculture that was here, as opposed to what was going on the sugar plantations, which is just brutal for women, pregnant women, or anybody, young people. It was just terrible. And until you get to Louisiana, you don't really have that. But by the time that's going, the population, there are 4 million black people, by the end of the Civil War, just a natural increase, and that was not happening in the West Indies at all. But rape was endemic in slavery.
Give me the mic, sir.
Boy, you're going to get a lot of exercise running around like that.
As I recall, when either the first or second of your books about Jefferson and Hemings were written, the DNA evidence had not been completed. And has that happened now? Because in those books, as I remember, there's a sentence by you, I'm paraphrasing, that Jefferson was somebody you admired and were horrified by. Mm-hmm. And the horrified part you're stating before the evidence was in on Hemings. Is the evidence in now?
Well, I thought the evidence was in when I was writing the book. The book came out in '97. The DNA tests were done in 1998. And then I did another edition of the book after that. No, I assumed, I mean, you know, a lot of slave owners had children with enslaved women. I mean, that was endemic. I mean, you know, and there were all kinds, there's rape. There were some people who had connections to each other in a way. So it never struck me that this was an unlikely thing. But I would say, I think the evidence is in. I mean, Monticello thinks the evidence is in. There are still some people who insist that it's not true. Some members of his legal family, descendants, who don't accept the Hemingses as their relatives. But there will always be people who feel that. I mean, I think if he came back and said, these are my kids, they'd say, you don't know what you're talking about. So I can't, but I don't know any most scholars believe that it's true. Every manuscript I get from people who write about Jefferson, it's written about as if it's true. You go to Monticello, they have a big family tree of the Hemingses, and he's on it as the father of her kids. The film that they do says that he's the father of their kids. So, yeah, in the historical profession, that's been accepted by most people. Sure.
So when you wrote that you were horrified by Jefferson, was it the slave ownership by itself?
Oh, no, the slave ownership, you know, the racism, you know, of it, but that's endemic at the time. What I was thinking mainly about is, and I sort of go back to those days, a person who knew better and yet didn't do more. I think I might have a different feeling now that I've gotten older and I've learned how hard it is to do anything. I'm less judgmental because I think about things that I could be doing that I haven't done, you know, tasks that I haven't taken on because, I mean, Jefferson was interested in the development of the United States of America. That was his passion. He wasn't interested in slavery. He wasn't in all the kinds of things that preoccupy us. It's like, I have helped to make a country, and I want that country to succeed. And that he threw himself into that. And he said, this other thing, it'll take care of itself. And you think about how many times you say in life, oh, here's the big problem. That other thing, we'll deal with that later. And it turns out that other thing is really the thing. It's really the thing. And slavery was the thing that destroyed the union that he helped to create. He thought that, you know, this could be worked out. With the Missouri crisis, when there was a crisis over whether or not, you know, Missouri was going to come in as a slave state and a free state, this is 18, you know, he's 1819, 1820, and he realizes, my God, they may go to war over this. They may destroy the thing that we created. And he just could not contemplate that. So it's this weird situation where we have a person who is obsessed by something that the United States of America, that's a pretty important thing. If you think about making a country out of nothing, and you say, I want to see this succeed, again, as I said, that other thing, it'll fix itself, but he doesn't realize that's the thing you need to fix. So at the time, when I say I'm horrified about it, I think I was a bit more judgmental about that than I am now as an older person and having, you know, tried a few things and failed at a few things and realized that it's difficult to do anything in the world. And it's difficult to do a lot of things, and he did a lot of things.
Thank you very much. You've made some interesting statements, and since you've done a lot of research about, you know, slave societies, this particular slave society, I wondered, did you look at whether Thomas Jefferson used his slaves as collateral for his loans in order to keep his plantation afloat?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the debt was a way of life. They used, he used slaves as collateral to try to pay off debts. He sold slaves to pay off debts, but he definitely mortgaged slaves. That was a big part of Southern society. And so when people say, oh, you know, I didn't own slaves, or my ancestors didn't own slaves, the fact is they were in a part of society where practices like that, giving credit, all of this stuff influences the economy. It's like saying, you know, I have nothing to do with the housing market because if I don't own a house, but that's not the way it works. It kept all of the society afloat. So he definitely did do that. In the early 1790s, he'd incurred a lot of debt from his father-in-law. He got a lot of wealth from them, slaves, but he had a massive amount of debt. And Jefferson was forever one step ahead of creditors and trying to do stuff. And so, yeah, he did do that. There was no ever foreclosure on them until the end. Because he was a prominent person, he was always able to get debt until the end. And when he dies, then of course, people are sold.
So what was the interest rate?
What was the interest rate? I have to look that up. I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to give you a figure. I mean, someone wrote a book about 4%. There was a book written about, you know, Jefferson was getting, 4% on his investment in slaves, which was not very much. First place is not true, but in second place, it was nowhere near that amount, he would not have been broke when he died. $107,000 in debt in 1826. That's millions of dollars.
Hi. I was just interested in your opinion about Georgetown University's recent statement saying that they're going to give admissions preference to descendants of the slaves that they sold to keep afloat at one time. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's just completely inadequate or a sincere gesture, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's probably a sincere gesture, but doesn't compensate for the amount of money that was received then. It's a tough question for them because, I mean, that would be their entire endowment. it would be the whole ball of wax. I think they're probably going to, I don't want to say rethink that, but they've gotten a lot of criticism about it. So I'm going to be interested to see what they do next with it. It's better, I'm glad that they have forthrightly acknowledged this because I could imagine people just not dealing with it at all. But legacy preference, I think they could probably do better than that. Well, go ahead, since she's close to you.
No, I was just going to say, just as a follow-up to her question, is that,
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, it's maybe even more of a comment, is that what happened in Georgetown is almost like a microcosm for this country, really. Mm-hmm. And that they needed to go a step further and offer tuition assistance at a minimum. And do you think that that might inspire other universities to do the same thing, and also perhaps, you know, the works of, the article written by Ta-Nehisi Coates about, reparations. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as gaining some momentum as a result of what has happened in Georgetown?
Well, I mean, all universities are grappling with this issue now because all the universities have, from that time period, have some connection to slavery. I think it will spark a discussion, just as it did at Brown, with what they did there. I don't know how far people are going to go. We don't know what's going to happen here. These are really interesting times. The presidential election, what has been unleashed. The idea of like wholesale reparation. Whatever is the right thing to do. This is an interesting time to be thinking about this kind of business because there are some really ugly forces out there. And so whatever the morality of it, I don't know. He's had his hand up quite a long time.
Thank you. I wanted to make two sort of comments and then a question. I think the thing with the so-called Jefferson Bible is another interesting thing that he, as you put it just now, didn't do. You know, it was something that was on his mind, and he kept it a secret, and that's
Oh,
where
he actually did the Bible.
Right. And so that, I thought, was a very interesting thing in the context of what you were just expressing about certain things that he thought about, but he didn't carry through. And then the other thing that hit me as you're talking about your new book, Most Blessed, that, which I'm just starting to read, actually, that in a way you did to Jefferson what Jefferson did to Jesus in the Jefferson Bible, which is, let's go back to what he said instead of what they said he said. And that's, I thought that was kind of interesting. My question is this, which is a topic that interests me a lot, is I find the process of Jefferson and his Jefferson Bible very interesting for a very curious historical reason, that the way he excerpted the sayings of Jesus, he comes close in his final selection to what was found 150 years later in the form of the Thomas Gospel. And I wonder if anybody has ever said anything about that. I know I have, but I have never really seen people come to grips with that. And it's very interesting because, of course, the writers of the New Testament quoted from the Thomas Gospel. And it's not surprising in a way then that Jefferson, who is taking the process backwards from what he has as the New Testament, and basically throws out all the circumstantial stuff and says, let's go back to the sayings, and lo and behold, he ends up with like a 75% correspondence to the Thomas Gospel.
No one has, I've not seen any writings about that.
Yeah,
About that kind of thing.
so it's very interesting that he sort of ends up forecasting, if you will, the rediscovery of the Thomas Gospel.
No, that's a very interesting point, and I haven't seen people make it or write about it. As for about the Jefferson Bible, he kept this really secret. His family did not even know that he had done this. Because if you could imagine, I mean, cutting up a Bible, I think it'd be kind of hard for me to cut up a Bible, even today. I mean, if somebody, what would happen to somebody in in the 18 teens if they said, look at this Bible, I've cut it up and I've fixed Jesus, fixed his word. I mean, that would just be the end of him. So, I mean, he would not have been on Mount Rushmore. Would not have been any of these things if people had known that he'd cut up the Bible and sort of fixed Jesus' words, or brought what he thought was Jesus' real teachings to folks. So I understand why he kept that a secret, because it's really hard now. Everybody thought he was an atheist at the time. When he was elected, people in New England thought people were burying their Bibles because they thought he was going to confiscate them. And someone said rape and murder, incest and adultery will be the norm if he's president, So I can see why he hid that.
Jefferson was not a prominent commander in the Continental Army, and I was curious, you mentioned Jefferson as a prism for understanding the early American Republic, and I was curious about whether or not his opposition to a standing army, the fact he had limited personal involvement in commanding the operations of the Continental Army, affected his understanding among his peers or his perception?
Well, Jefferson was not in the Army. He was the war governor of Virginia, but was never in the military. And Marshall and some people kind of held that against him, that he hadn't fought. But, they made him the governor. And he was in the Continental Congress, and he did those kinds of things. He was not a military person. That's a really big difference between, I would say, Jefferson and Hamilton, who was very much the militarist. When Jefferson is inaugurated, he doesn't wear the sword because he didn't want, Washington, of course, wore one, and Adams, that must have been funny, for him wearing a sword. I sort of mentally imagine this, wearing a sword. He didn't do it because he wanted to say that you could be the leader of a country and not project war. His saying was, peace is our passion. And so when he's president, and his idea of a sanction against Great Britain is an embargo. an economic embargo instead of going to war. Now, eventually, the United States did go to war, the War of 1812, but people did say, you didn't fight. You know, you were not a military person, and you are, you know, you're a coward, in essence, because he wasn't, you know, that was never a part of his, he had no interest in, you know, martial glory or whatever, and that did affect the way people saw him. Because John Marshall had been in the war, and those people had sort of bonded together as, you know, band of brothers, and he was sort of outside of it, and they resented him being the commander-in-chief when he didn't have that experience.
Hi, I have two questions that might be somewhat related. I was wondering if Jefferson had any other sustained relationships, such as the one that he had with Sally Hemings. It seems like it went on for a number of years. There was some consideration there. He looked after the children in his will and whatnot. Were there any other women that he had that same type of relationship? And then, going back to the term patriarch, I of course think of back in the Old Testament where you were able to have multiple wives, and you were sort of expected to be begetting all over the place.
Begetting and begetting.
And was there any sense of irony? Did this have anything to do with his sexuality, do you think, that he was embracing the term patriarch?
I kind of think it did. When he says, you know, he's talking about his farm and I'm like a patriarch of old, people know what the patriarchs of old were like. And that was a part of it. That was certainly a part of it. We don't, I mean, embrace that in the same way. You know, we're much more puritanical about it, but I have no way of knowing. But I think that was a part of it as well. That was sort of an image that he had of himself, because it was the truth. He was living there with a concubine. That term, you know, that's what was going on. You know, there were people in the 40s, in the 1940s, who said that, you know, Jefferson was promiscuous with the slave women at Monticello. And people claimed descent from him. Others claimed descent from him. But I'm thinking in one particular case of the person that they said was the ancestor, he wasn't in the country when that person was conceived. So, I mean, is it possible that he slept with other slave women? Sure.
But I meant more had a considered relationship.
No. There's not any mention of him, you know, with any woman, white or enslaved, after he comes back from France with Sally Hemings. So no. I mean, the speculation about other children or other women, there's no way to prove that or disprove it, but there's certainly not somebody that people are talking about from the 1790s up into the 1820s. It's, you know, when he's in office, his enemies are talking about the Congo harem, the African harem that he has, but nobody in Charlottesville or Richmond, when they talk about him and, you know, that, it's always Sally Hemings. There's nobody else who's mentioned, but the political enemies, you know, make up the African harem, the Congo harem, crazy stuff. The Congo, what does she have to do with the Congo?
Do you think Jefferson was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because he was, as a politician, he was saying that slaves, black people and white people could not mix together. He was saying it politically, but yet he was torn romantically with Sally Hemings. And the other part of my question is, why do you think Sally's children were all freed, but he did not free her?
Okay.
As a romantic, I'm thinking because he wanted her to be with him for the rest of their lives or whatever, yada, yada, yada.
But he's dead. The first part of it is, the interesting question about the gap between what he's saying about the inability for people to mix together. The question is, why is he talking about this at all? No, but why? I mean, you think about it, we don't have Madison is not talking about race mixing. You know, Marshall is not talking about race mixing. We kind of know now that sometimes when people are against things and they feel compelled to sort of come out against it. It may mean that they have some internal struggle themselves on the matter. And I think because people were gossiping about this, and because he lived in a household where his wife brought her 6 half-siblings, mixed-race half-siblings, to live with them. I know, but I'm just saying, but when he married her, and they come to Monticello, a lot of women whose fathers and brothers and sons had children with enslaved women, they would have them sold. They'd have them some other place. Jefferson had 5 plantations. The Hemingses she did not have to bring them to the house. So he's living surrounded by mixed-race people. He understands, and he feels that they're different than other people, but I think he is conflicted about it. Now, why he doesn't free Sally Hemings, remember I mentioned if you freed a slave, you had to petition the legislature, or I think you could do it at a county court, to allow the person to remain in the state. That means he would have had to put her name in his will. The other thing is, if you freed somebody, you couldn't free a person below 21 or above 45 without explaining how you were going to take care of them for the rest of their lives. So he would have to say, please free Sally Hemings, and here is how I'm going to provide for her. I'm going to give her a house, I'm going to give her land and money to take, to make sure, because she's, at this time, she's 53 years old. So I don't think he wanted, as his sort of last act on earth, to basically admit that he'd been living with this woman for 38 years. I mean, we would never have argued about that. If that had been in his will, that he was freeing her, asking for permission for her to stay in Virginia, which they may not have granted. They didn't have to grant it. And here's how I'm going to take care of her for the rest of her life, that would have been an admission. And if you think that cutting up the Bible was a problem, that would be a big problem. The easier thing to do is what happened. When he dies, she goes into Charlottesville, and she's pretty much left alone. She appears in the census of 1830 as a free white person. They do a special census in 1833 after Nat Turner, and everybody was scared. They went around and asked black people in Virginia whether they wanted to go back to Africa. So they go and they ask Sally Hemings and her sons, do they want to go back to Africa? And she says no. And in that census, she's listed as a free Negro. So, and they say she was freed in 1826. So what happens is the community, and this is the great thing as a law professor, this is a great thing to me, there's law in the books, and then there's law on the ground. And if everybody in the community wants to treat her like a free person, then that's what they do. In official records, she's listed as a free person, even though there's no deed, though he doesn't officially free her. I don't think he freed her because I don't think he wanted to admit. I mean, he has daughters, he has 12 white grandchildren, and that would destroy his legacy. I mean, I would not be standing up here talking about him now, because he'd be some obscure person who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and even if, if they had known about it before he was elected president, he would never have been elected president. So he's all about legacy. I've created this country, I'm a revolutionary, and I'm going to live forever, in the minds of people. But not if he admits that he had 7 children with Sally Hemings. That was going to happen. So that is my only supposition as to why he didn't free her. He freed her informally, but not with documents that would tell historians what had happened at Monticello.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, where are we? Hi.
I truly enjoyed this. You mentioned the play Hamilton a few times, so I wanted to know from a historical context, what did you think about the portrayal of Hamilton and Jefferson?
Well, first place, I love the musical. I love it. I listen to I have the soundtrack on my, the cast album, I guess you should call it. It's fiction. It's a piece of historical fiction. I think it's brilliant. But Hamilton was not an ardent abolitionist. Hamilton joined the Manumission Society. I think he went to one meeting. He was certainly better on the question of race than Jefferson. But I think the play, in order to make him palatable to modern audiences, and I suppose this is progress, right? That he has to be right on the slavery question. So that's emphasized much more than it makes sense. He did not believe, there's one line when he says, we'll never be free until the people in bondage have the same rights as you and me. He didn't think that. But it makes you like him. The Alexander Hamilton who is on stage is infinitely more attractive than the real Alexander Hamilton was. So there's that. He was an elitist. I mean, he hated immigrants. You know, with the Alien Sedition Act, where, you know, people were thrown out of the, where people wanted to throw people out of the country, he wanted all of them thrown out. He was not. So here he's all the things that you would want a modern hero to be. You know, he's right on race, he's right on, well, he doesn't talk about race that much, but right on slavery. He is pro-immigrant, which he was not. You know, he believed that the president should serve for life. An elected president, but it would be democratic because he would be elected, but he would serve for life. The Senate would serve for life. But see, if he was singing about that up on stage, people would be like, I don't know. I don't know if I like that idea. There's that. Now, and Jefferson, I mean, the other thing is, Jefferson was a slave owner, that's right, it's great. Not great, but you know what I mean. That's portrayed up there. But if you didn't know anything about American history, you would think the only slaveholder up there was Jefferson. What about Madison and Washington? We still don't know how to write about Washington as a human being. Nobody knows how to do that. You know, not in books, not in. I mean, even it's Washington, and there he is. You know, the pride of Mount Vernon. And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, yeah, the pride of Mount Vernon. I mean, wait a minute. You know, Mount Vernon is this plantation. But even Washington is this larger-than-life figure, and it's, that's fine. I think it's fine for an evening in theater. But I just would hope that people don't think that it's real. I'm glad it's introduced. I was talking to someone today talking about what they're doing in the schools. They're having students, do their own characterizations. People are Phyllis Wheatley. People are other black founders, people that, whose names aren't known as much. So it has great potential for opening up history for lots of people. And it's a genius. I mean, he's an absolute genius. But it's not, it isn't history. So.
Thank you so much.